I've talked a lot about verb types in my various videos on the Georgian language, about the four main classes of verbs based on form and voice. One of the really interesting classes of verbs are the Medio-Active Verbs, which are largely intransitive and carry a sort of medial active voice, and an atelic lexical aspect, which means they don't play well with perfective aspect and it makes their conjugation different from the other classes. But this stuff isn't really important to what I wanted to talk about today. I wanted to talk specifically about a small subset of these verbs which can express a direct object and thus act as transitive verbs, optionally. When I first heard this, I was a bit suspicious. It makes sense in English because that's kinda how English verbs work, where an active transitive verb has the same form as a sort of middle voice intransitive. For example, if I say the simple sentence, I am hiding, it could mean the transitive, I am hiding my shame, and I just left that part out, or it could mean the intransitive, I am hiding in the bathroom. If I say, I am shooting, I could mean I am shooting a gun, or I am shooting through the sky. But that's not what I mean. Verbs in Georgian are not like this. They are generally transitive or intransitive. Damalavs, or to hide, is transitive, while daimaliba, or to be hidden, is intransitive. What's more, Georgian is a pro-drop language with polypersonal agreement. This means that a direct or indirect object is marked on the verb in addition to the subject. For example, as I said, damalavs is a transitive verb, meaning he will hide it. I can write man is damala, he hid it, which is clearly transitive, or I can just drop these unemphatic pronouns and write damala, which means the exact same thing. The person and number of the subject and direct object are marked in that verb form, so pronouns are only needed for emphasis. So if I say that a verb like to play is optionally transitive, think about it for a minute. Sure, I can say sheshas tamashobs and tamashobs and claim that the latter sentence is intransitive because I sure don't see a direct object anywhere, but this looks an awful lot like that example that we've just seen. How do we know that the latter sentence is not equivalent to the transitive analog with the unemphatic pronouns dropped? I would ask you to think about this for a minute. In a pro-drop language like Georgian, how can you tell if a sentence is truly intransitive or if it is transitive and the unemphatic direct object pronoun was just not specified? Essentially, the English analog of the basic question being answered is, how can we tell if a sentence like, I am shooting, is transitive if the direct object is not overtly stated outside of the verb? Of course, discounting the possibility that I could mean some middle voice intransitive like I am shooting through the air. For those of you that had some ideas, congratulations. For those of you who just want to enjoy the show, I'll give an overview of a few tricks that you can use in this situation. Now, I'll have to talk a little bit about verbal nouns in Georgian and how we can specify the subjects and objects and indirect objects of these verbal nouns. Now, I made a big deal at the beginning of this video that verbs in Georgian are either intransitive or transitive, but this applies only to finite forms like I did it or it was done. In non-finite forms like verbal nouns, the same form is used for intransitive and transitive variants. So, the verbal noun meaning to do or doing corresponds to both he did it and it was done. In this way, Georgian verbal nouns are like those of English. With a transitive verb like to hide, the English hiding and Georgian damalva can refer either to the hiding of something by someone or just to the hiding of someone with no something to speak of. Now let's go further with this and think about how these verbal nouns interact with genitives. In English, if I say the hiding of the agent or the agent's hiding, a few things come into my mind. One is concerned with an intransitive version of the verb to hide, perhaps a secret agent hiding from the government. Another is similar, but with a transitive version of the verb to hide, with something like the government as an underlying subject. So the hiding of the agent by the government. The agent is still hidden, but this time it is the object of a theoretical verb whose subject is the government. Now the third thing I think of, which seems much less natural to me than the previous example, is the agent's hiding of something else, like government secrets. Now these first two options have clear analogs in Georgian using similar terminology. Mtavrobismir translates directly to by the government, the same with mtavrobisagan. However, this third one doesn't work at all because in Georgian, these genitives used with verbal noun constructions are much less flexible, so in English, the phrase the agent's hiding could refer to an action with the agent as the subject or object of the simple transitive it hides it. And this is generalizable to any transitive verb. For example, the sentence vanos datera makes no sense, whereas in English we would be able to assume that the phrase vanos writing refers to some written work of Vano, or in other words, an action wherein Vano is the subject of the simple sentence, it writes it. Because an action wherein Vanos is the object of the sentence, it writes it, is strange. In Georgian, these genitives are not as flexible, and the only appropriate interpretation is that Vano is being written, which is only a valid statement under the uncommon insight that we are living in a simulation. A much more natural way to say this third sentence in English, I think, is the hiding of the documents by the agent, where, as in the more natural example, the direct object of the transitive verb, he hides it, is in the genitive, and the agent, is marked with a special grammatical agent marking preposition by. So looking at both versions of that sentence, we see that English genitives used with verbal nouns can refer to both the subject and object of that verbal noun, but it's a bit more natural to have just one genitive that refers to the object. Now in Georgian, this is exactly what we see happening mandatorily. We literally say the documents hiding by the agent. So in Georgian, as is most natural in English, the usage of a genitive with a verbal noun denotes the subject of an intransitive or the object of a transitive, which in either case is sort of the full recipient of the action. The subject of he hid it and the object of she hid him are both the ones being hidden. If only English were ergative, so we would have a halfway decent way to denote this idea. So to recap, in English we sort of have an ambiguity that is not present in Georgian. If I say the x of y for verbal noun y, we can have x as one of the following, whereas in Georgian we cannot have x as the subject of a transitive verb. So let's talk about the medio-active verb to play, which I claim is optionally transitive in Georgian. I realize now that I have not yet defined transitive, but it has a very simple definition. A verb is transitive if it has both a subject and a direct object. So knowing what we now know about genitives and agent-defining phrases used with verbal nouns in Georgian, we can look at some relevant sentences and try to hash this out. As I pointed out earlier, the tricky part about transitivity lies in the question of whether a verb without an overtly expressed direct object is transitive with an unspoken direct object, because of Georgian's pro-dropness. So let's start from the easy side first, and look at a verb that we know is transitive. Since a transitive verb is one with a subject and direct object, all we need is a clause with both a subject and a direct object. The playing of checkers by Vano. So, we see Vanos mier sheshis tamashi. It's exactly what we'd expect given the rules we've discussed. The object is in the genitive and the subject agent is marked with the agent defining adposition mier. But to say Vanos playing without a specified game, let's think about what we'd expect. Since in this genitive construction, the subject of an intransitive verbal noun is marked in the genitive, and the subject of a transitive verbal noun is marked with an agent-specifying phrase, the answer actually depends on whether or not the verb is transitive. If the sentence Vano tamashobs is transitive, then we would expect the phrase Vanos mir tamashi, which mirrors the formations we've seen with transitive verbs like to write. If the sentence Vano tamashobs is intransitive, then we would expect the sentence Vanos tamashi. And since I already told you that this verb is optionally transitive, I'm sure you've already gathered that indeed the correct expression is Vanos tamashi. What's more, the sentence Vanos mir tamashi is actually seen as ungrammatical, meaning that not only is tamashobs sometimes intransitive, but rather it is always intransitive when a direct object is not expressed outside of the verb. Fun stuff. Now I'm going to show you one more phenomenon that points to this verb being optionally transitive. This next example is a bit less applicable to English because we mark our obliques like our indirect objects in the dative, but I'll explain it quickly just to give this video a bit more breadth. It has to do with causatives. Georgian verbs can form causatives, and like in many languages, this can present some problems to the standard term marking. Let me show you what I mean. Say you have some intransitive verb like to wait. In Georgian, like in English, to wait is an intransitive verb, and that for which the waiting is weighted waits as an indirect object. I'll use examples in the aorist series as this is the only series in Georgian that case marks its subjects, direct objects, and indirect objects distinctly. So if I say the frog waited for the toad, then the frog is in the nominative, as is normal for intransitive subjects in all series, and the indirect object is in the dative. If I then turn this verb elodeba into a causative, then the subject of the intransitive becomes the direct object of the transitive causative form, and the one causing the action becomes the subject. So in the sentence, I caused the frog to wait for the toad, I as the grammatical subject and marked in the narrative, and the frog is now marked in the nominative as a direct object, as Georgian's alignment in the aorist series is ergative or active, and the toad stays the same as an indirect object. In case it's unclear, I'm coloring these nouns not based on the cases used, but based on the grammatical roles of the participants, orange for subjects, teal for direct objects, and purple for indirect objects. This is just so that I don't have to talk about ergativity. Now, of course, transitive verbs can also form causatives, but we are immediately presented with a problem in case marking. If we have a sentence like, the toad sewed himself a shirt, we see that this, being a transitive verb, already has a direct object. So if we want to form a causative of this verb, to sew, then case marking like we do with causatives of intransitives would be problematic. We can't have two direct objects, so if we make the initial subject toad the direct object of the causative, then we need to do something with the initial direct object shirt, maybe demote it to an indirect object or some retired term. Now this is what some languages do, but as it worked out in Georgian, we would have the direct object of the caused clause, shirt, marked as the direct object of the causative, and the subject of the caused clause, toad, marked as an indirect object. Indirect objects of the initial sentence are retired or done away with. This sentence's verb marks a reflexive indirect object, but the causative verb form will not reflect this. Such expressions can be taken care of with an adpositional phrase if necessary. So we can say, I made the toad sew a shirt. Of course, the syntax differs from this English version in that the toad is an indirect object and the shirt is a direct object, which is flipped from the standard English version. A more syntactically literal translation would be something like, I sewed the shirt through the toad, or something like that. And of course, since Georgian is a pro-drop language, even if the direct object isn't overtly expressed in the sentence, the case marking still acts like this. So we have the sentence, I made the toad sew it. Even though we don't see a direct object in the sentence outside of the verb, we can again tell that this verb to sew is always transitive because causative constructions mark the subject of this caused clause in the dative as an indirect object, not in the nominative as a direct object, such that we know there must be an unspoken direct object marked in the nominative. But anyways, knowing this, it's pretty easy to see how we can see if a verb like to play is transitive. If it acts as intransitive, then the subject of the caused clause will stand in the nominative as a direct object in a causative construction, and if it acts as transitive, then that subject will stand in the dative as an indirect object. The transitive version of tamashi that takes a direct object should act like the transitive verbs we've seen no matter what, and indeed it does, with the direct object of the caused clause checkers marked as the direct object of the causative here. And the version without a direct object, like we saw from the last method, acts like a normal intransitive verb with the subject of the caused clause, the toad, marked as a direct object. If the caused clause were treated as transitive, then the toad would be marked in the dative, as in the transitive example above. So both of these methods using causatives and verbal nouns yield the same result, that this verb tamashi is transitive when a direct object is expressed outside of the verb and is otherwise intransitive. There are some other verbs that show this behavior too, like to talk or to dance. While the fact that these verbs are optionally transitive might not seem super interesting at face value, especially to a viewer base whose single most unifying characteristic is likely to be fluency in a language whose transitive verbs are optionally intransitive, this was a really interesting revelation for me given that Georgian verbs are not generally like this, and the part that I find most fun must be the creative methods that can be used to prove such a strange fact. As a closing note, proving whether something is transitive or intransitive is useful for characterizing certain things about the Georgian language, in particular its case marking alignment. In my first video on the Georgian language, I presented an argument that it is of active rather than ergative alignment in its aorist series, and this argument was predicated on the fact that there exists a large class of intransitive verbs that take their subjects in the narrative in this series, thus acting like transitive verbs in an ergative system. This class of verbs, of course, is the medio-active group, which includes the optionally transitive verbs like to dance and to play, as well as verbs that can never take a direct object like to croak. A counterargument to that conclusion might be to argue that these medio-active verbs are all actually transitive and just don't show overt direct objects. that to play and to dance always have a hidden direct object of some general game or dance, even when it does not appear outside of the verb, and that to croak always has some hidden direct object such that the full sentence is something like "the frog croaks a croak." If this were true, then we could indeed characterize Georgian's second series as having an ergative alignment, but the fact that we can use these methods to show the intransitivity of these verbs invalidates that argument and thus allows us to characterize it as active.